Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd. Welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brian.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming back and joining us for another exciting adventure in history. So the plan for today's episode is that we are continuing our exploration of the Titanic saga from the passenger's perspective. And Courtney has done a tremendous amount of research on this from all the many primary sources that she has been researching. So
every time I have it put together and I'm like, I've got 2 or 3 ahead, I always find something else or something to tweak. But then it leads me off in these wonderful directions that give such a depth to the story.
Yes, it really has changed quite a bit from the overall. When we first started this project, we had an outline and what we thought we were talking. Yeah, I know.
That outline is, it's archaic now.
Yep, it's gone. So anyway, so where we left off last episode was that the Titanic was traveling through the North Atlantic near the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, Canada, when she collided with an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on Sunday night, April 14th, 1912. The passengers experienced the collision in different ways, which led some to go back to sleep, while others they left their staterooms to investigate the unknown disturbance. After being reassured by the crew that there was no danger, most of the passengers returned to their cabins. Of the first-class passengers who chose to remain above decks, they were either on the boat deck or mingling in the public rooms on Promenade Deck A while they waited for an update. So, with that said, let's go back in time.
And that brings us to midnight. We've officially crossed over to Monday, April 15th, 1912. The first lifeboat will be lowered in 40 minutes, and the ship will disappear into the Atlantic in about 2 hours and 20 minutes. So here's a throwback to one of our very first Titanic episodes. Dad, do you remember when we talked about the non-disputable timeline?
Sure do.
The one that essentially consisted of the time of collision, Sunday, April 14th, 1912 at 11:40, and the time of Titanic's final sinking, Monday, April 15th, 1912, at 2:20 a.m. We've officially arrived at those cryptic middle chapters of the story. So even with the amazing number of primary sources related to Titanic, and we are really blessed with that, there is, compared to other topics, there is just so much material to work with for this. But there are still moments within the timeline that are shrouded in mystery. The glaringly obvious reason for this is how few people survived the disaster. According to the U.S. Senate inquiry, out of the 2,223 people aboard Titanic, only 706 survived.
Oh, my goodness.
Now, keep in mind, that's just off the U.S. Senate inquiry. The British inquiry has different numbers. Other people have different numbers. Nobody can even agree how many people were on board or how many people died.
It's interesting how many things are disputable.
There's a lot. There's less
when it comes to
that's
Titanic.
agreed upon. It's out of this world. So, as you can imagine, many of the still unanswered questions about the disaster center around the persons whose lives and voices were lost. Also, in the immediate aftermath of the collision, the passengers' primary concern was not keeping a minute-by-minute record of what they saw and heard. They were either wandering the decks looking for answers or had just rolled back over and gone to sleep. And because their recollections were written after the fact, the passengers had to estimate how much time had elapsed between events.
And when you're in the middle of an emergency, you don't really stop to look at your watch.
No,
or
definitely
a clock on
not.
the wall. So you're focused on taking care of yourself, taking care of your loved ones, helping people around you. So I can see where some of the discrepancy would have come from.
Oh, absolutely. And it's like hindsight 2020, like if it was one of those, you could go back in time and you could watch everything and, follow people around and record minute by minute. That would be fantastic, but it's just not practical in a real life situation.
No, it isn't.
So another factor that complicates nailing down the Titanic timeline holds true for traumatic events in general. People are terrible witnesses. It is well known in the fields of psychology and true crime that when faced with a traumatic or shocking event, people have a very difficult time retaining or recalling details, and they're also very suggestible. So trying to create an accurate timeline of 2,000 some odd people under these circumstances more than 100 years later is very difficult.
That makes perfect sense. Yes, I can understand that. I've only been in a few situations in my life that were very traumatic, and it was very difficult, like you said, to remember details of what was going on.
Well, I remember So we're from California. So what happens in California? Earthquakes. And I remember being in a very large auditorium. There's probably 50 kids up on a stage. We're having a concert or like band practice or something, choir practice. And one of those really big earthquakes hit. And it was one that literally crumbled buildings. People died. It was a big earthquake. And I remember everyone's kind of looking around and you're trying to fill in the blanks like, is that a big semi truck that went by? Are people up on the roof of the auditorium? Like the noise was so weird. And then the shaking started. And I don't remember coming down off the stage. I don't remember making it outside, but somehow I did. So there is kind of that in the moment when things really start gearing up that you just kind of go blank in a way.
And if you remember that time that I think I had all three of you girls. We were in the pharmacy when the earthquake.
Those are the younger three. That was the same earthquake.
Yeah, and that was the show. We basically just huddled in the center there, and all the shelves around us tumbled to the floor. And when the rumbling stopped, we kind of looked around, and everything was down the floor. And
I'm sure that you were not able to tell people exactly what time that happened.
No, I could not tell you exactly what time. I can't even tell you which earthquake that was at this point in time. I've lived through so many. But
oh, that's true. That is very true. That is being a California native right there.
That is.
But further adding to the confusion is the fact that by midnight each day, the clocks all throughout Titanic were supposed to be set back a total of 47 minutes. This was to account for the westbound time loss. The clocks were not set back the full 47 minutes all at once, but they were rather divided between two watches, like a watch for the crew, like a shift.
Oh, my goodness.
So the one set was 23 extra minutes was worked by one watch, and the remaining 24 extra minutes was worked by the other watch. So the clocks throughout the ship were adjusted automatically by two master clocks located in the chart room, each of which controlled 24 clocks for a total of 48. So when one of the master clocks was adjusted, so too were all the clocks connected to it. The issue is, based on survivor testimony, that the collision happened after one of the master clocks had been adjusted and all of those that were connected to it, but before the other was supposed to be set back.
Oh, no.
So when Third Officer Pittman was asked during the U.S. Senate inquiry if the clocks were set at midnight on Sunday night, he very pithily replied, "No, we had something else to think of."
And did they ask him, are you the 23-minute crew or the 20,
right.
or the 24-minute crew? Which one are you? So
were you there on time?
Did we go forward or backwards?
Man.
Yeah, no, that is just problematic.
And it's so interesting because apparently this is something that's disputed. Surprise, it's disputed. And so people like to argue, is it one setback of 23 minutes? Is it one setback of 47 minutes? Is it one of 23 and then 24? But there are some absolutely incredible articles out there that I have. We will post them on theprimarynerd.com. Please feel free to read them. They are... It took multiple read-throughs. This guy is operating on a level that I aspire to at some point. So
when
anyway.
you have that many variables in just a simple when it comes to timekeeping, there's going to be mistakes or things are not going to get done.
Right.
Or in this case here, when it occurred right near midnight or close to midnight, which clock could we look at to make sure that we are accurate? Yeah.
And that it's exactly. So why does this matter? Because this means that even if a passenger or crew member happened to glance at a clock and make a mental note of the time, which again is not really human nature, if they're going to make a mental note of the time at which an event occurred, they could have been looking at a clock that was still on Titanic Standard Time, in which midnight equals 12 a.m., or a clock that had been adjusted to reflect Titanic Corrected Time, which would have been the 23 to 24 minutes slower.
I like that. Titanic Standard Time or Titanic Corrected Time?
There is a whole subgenre of Titanic time.
Oh my goodness.
And when things happened. Midnight is a pivotal time in the Titanic story, and yet there's so much confusion and debate surrounding that time that it has turned into quite the academic battlefield. Essentially, there are two camps of historians. Those who believe that midnight was the time at which Titanic's inevitable doom was established, and those who believe that this realization did not occur until 12:25 a.m. So for those in the midnight camp, they argue that the subsequent mustering of passengers and crew was done with the full knowledge that Titanic would sink in 2 hours or less. Alternately, the historians who followed the 12:25 a.m. model argue that the passengers and crew were mustered merely as a precautionary measure while additional inspections were being conducted, and that they were not loading them into the boats and going until after 12:25.
Well, so far, what we've heard in the quotes that we have shared, that it did seem to be the second here, where they were like, they didn't seem to be really, hey, we're sinking, get in the boats, and it was more
The
of
sense
a
of
precaution.
urgency comes later.
Yes, it comes
Definitely.
later. Mm-hmm.
So, but just for, letting all y'all out there know, there are two camps of historians. So that if you are reading a particular Titanic book and they just unequivocally state it has to be this time, we just want you to be aware there is debate about this.
Okay.
So,
good to know.
And then, let me see, where did it go? So precautionary measure. There we go. Both camps obviously have reasons, data, evidence on which they've based their conclusions, but as there is no way to definitively solve the timeline question, barring new primary sources being discovered, it really does come down to a judgment call. As the creators of the Primary Nerd podcast, our goal is to facilitate greater understanding of historical events by listening to the voices of those who lived through them. We also strive to present accurate, verifiable information. Therefore, we have crafted this episode to be event-driven, not time-driven. We have focused on the events as they unfolded without necessarily committing to exact timestamps. As with previous episodes, if the timing of an event is disputed, as basically they all are, we will give an approximate time range to provide context. By adopting this methodology, we hope to maintain focus on the overall narrative and avoid getting sidelined by the minutia. We really don't want to lose the forest for the trees.
No, we don't. And so, in talking about, you had mentioned about the earthquake and about disasters. I was part of the Loma Prieta earthquake in California. I was working for a utility at the time. I actually was standing in front of a plate glass window when it struck, and I was mesmerized by watching the poles across the street, the 35-foot tall power poles, wooden poles, moving 5 feet either direction to the left and to the right. It was like that ride at a fair.
I'm picturing like the
ship,
Viking ship.
The Viking ship. And I was mesmerized, and somebody yelled and said, "Get down." And I thought, yeah, that's pretty stupid that I'm standing in front of a plate glass window.
You're like, what am I doing?
So I got duck under the desk, and shortly thereafter come to find out the Bay Bridge had collapsed. I mean, it was a very tragic, very, very tragic, eventful day. But if you were to ask me what time did that happen,
or did this thing happen before or after?
Right, I couldn't really tell you. I was mesmerized. It was amazing. I've never seen anything like that in my life, and I did not know that the terra firma that we live on would actually act like water. It was like water.
That's crazy.
It was crazy. So anyway, with all that said, so sometime between midnight and 12:15 a.m., the order was given to get the passengers up on deck with their lifebelts. Just as there were various ways in which the passengers experienced Titanic's collision with the iceberg, there are many ways in which the passengers were advised of the lifebelt order. Some heard the order directly from Captain Smith or Thomas Andrews. Some bedroom stewards advised and assisted the passengers in their care promptly, while other passengers did not receive the order from their stewards until almost an hour after the collision. Some were warned by fellow passengers. Some happened to notice that people were walking past with lifebelts on and simply followed suit. And some, it is fair to assume, were not warned at all. I mean, if I saw people walking around in lifebelts, I'm going to put one on.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go.
Like, wait a minute. Are we having a dress-up party? What's happening here?
No. So a couple of the first-class passengers personally alerted by Captain Smith were first-class passengers Gladys Cherry and Cornelia Andrews. They had come up to the promenade deck to see the ice for themselves and stuck around to see what happened next. Gladys later wrote that, quote, "We went forward and saw the bow of the ship covered in ice, but we could not see the berg. We wondered if we should go back to bed or not, when suddenly the captain appeared and said, 'I don't want to frighten anyone, but will you go quietly and put on your life belts and go up on the top deck?' We were dispersed very calmly and slowly and got to our own stateroom, but could find no life belts. Then our steward came. I did not even know that the order for lights at all had been given," he said, "but he got them out for us from under the bed." So here you have lifebelt order
Mm-hmm.
that steward doesn't know about, and you obviously can't find the belts on your own, so maybe that goes back to the postings that were not listed from the incomplete.
You know, it really makes you wonder because
Makes you
that's
wonder.
the Eleanor Caspier quote about the notices,
Mm-hmm.
that the frames were in the staterooms but not the
Yeah.
notices. And I mean, one would assume, what would you really need to post in a stateroom? You would think it would be emergency exits or, you know, in case of emergency sort of things. And for the steward not to know. Now, granted, these ladies were up on deck. So if you think about this, Titanic was not fitted with any sort of a alarm system, PA system.
Oh, okay.
There's nothing of that sort. And so, but there's telephones. We know, or they were, there's telephones because we know there's a phone up in the crow's nest that goes to the bridge. We also know that there's ways of communicating from the bridge down to the engine room. That's how they know to slow, stop, full ahead, half ahead, etc. So there's some rudimentary communication going on through the ship, but it does actually, it makes sense that unless the stewards happened to have gotten it from somebody else, if these women were up on deck and they were with the captain, you know, they were probably some of the very first people to be aware.
Oh, that makes sense. Because if there is no PA, and you're right, and they're up on the deck with the captain, and they come down, the stewards down below would
Maybe
not
they
have known.
didn't, maybe nobody got to him yet.
That's a good point. So
But it doesn't inspire a whole lot of confidence.
no, and and I would have thought with 2,200 souls on board, I would think that safety would have been an utmost. There'd be all kinds of procedures and processes, but then again, we're all talking 1912.
Unsinkable ship.
Well, that's true. Unsinkable. You're
Coming
right.
back to that unsinkable ship.
Well, let's go. So there was also a couple of another passenger claimed to have been warned by the captain himself was first class passenger Marie Young, who said, quote, "Suddenly Captain Smith ran downstairs calling out, 'Put on your life belts.' It seemed impossible we could have really understood his words, so full of tragic import, and spoken on such a gigantic, unsinkable boat as the Titanic." So once again, the mindset was big, unsinkable, and this can't happen to us, or there really wasn't anything going on that led them to believe that there was something seriously happening.
I mean, at this point, nothing really has occurred besides they've all been standing around. They were all told to go to bed. And then all of a sudden, here comes this order. It would have seemed very jarring, I would think. And also,
I would think, yes.
I would like to point out, there's a big difference between, I don't want to frighten anyone, but will you all go quietly and put on your life belts? And everyone get your life belts now! Like, this is a radically different attitude.
Yeah, I would say so.
It makes me wonder, okay, so did this happen concurrently? Was this later on in the night? Like, all she says is that she was warned personally by Captain Smith. She doesn't timestamp it.
Okay.
So, I don't know.
We'll just take it at that. So, based on the recollections of first-class passenger Isaac Frunthal, another person that Captain Smith personally warned was Colonel John Jacob Astor. Isaac had gone up in search of information and claims to have witnessed the following interaction. Quote, "There were a few people on deck, and none of them seemed to be agitated. Presently, I saw the captain appear, apparently from the bridge, and several men approached him. One of these was Colonel Astor, and I heard him say to Captain Smith, 'Captain, my wife is not in good health. She has gone to bed, and I don't want to get her up unless it's absolutely necessary.' 'What is the situation?' Captain Smith replied quietly. 'Colonel Astor, you had better get your wife up at once. I fear that we may have to take to the boats.' Colonel Astor never changed expression. He thanked the captain courteously and walked rapidly, but composedly toward the nearest companionway."
And keep in mind, neither Captain Smith nor Colonel Astor survived the Titanic disaster, so they can't confirm or deny that this conversation ever happened. But there are a few other quotes that we will discuss later that do lend some credibility to Isaac's account. So this brings up an interesting point, the nature of the relationship between Captain Smith and many of the passengers. As I read through the primary sources, the recorded interactions between Captain Smith and the first-class passengers are consistently polite and professional, but remote. He's clearly a busy man, and the passengers were engaged in their own activities. It reminded me of the relationship between pilots and passengers on airplanes today. We as passengers don't bond with the pilot, primarily because he or she is in the cockpit for the duration of the flight, but we cheer when the plane lands safely, thank them politely if they make an appearance, and then disembark. Airline travel is a means to an end, and while we appreciate the pilot and crew for safely delivering us to our destination, they're quickly forgotten. I therefore concluded that while the passengers may have respected Captain Smith due to the nature of his position, there was not any sort of personal relationship to speak of. And as it turns out, that could not be farther from the truth.
Really?
Yes, so this is one of the sections that I literally just encountered. As we had mentioned in a previous episode, many of the first-class passengers traveling on Titanic were wealthy Americans returning home to participate in the upcoming social season that took place during the summer months on the East Coast. Historian Rich Archbold gave additional details relating to their lifestyle, saying, quote, "Most of the first-class passengers basking in the prestige of Titanic's maiden voyage were wealthy Americans returning home after the winter season on the continent. They belonged to a transatlantic leisure class, a recently evolved breed that led, what it seemed, in the years before the First World War, a charmed life." Walter Lord referred to this group of people as cosmopolites, which he defined as, quote, "a large set of fashionable people whose lifestyle went far beyond the boundaries of any one nation. Americans, British, and a sprinkling of continentals, they lived an international life of their own, restlessly migrating from country to country, from season to season."
Wow, that's a heck of a life.
I know. According to Walter Lord, this subset of first-class passengers, quote, "knew the crew almost as well as each other, because it was the custom to cross with certain captains rather than on particular ships, and Captain Smith had a personal following which made him invaluable to the White Star Line. The captain repaid the patronage with little favors and privileges which kept them coming." Walter Lord described Captain Smith as a splendid innkeeper, gradually building up a loyal clientele of devoted passengers. And that's a quote. That's a direct quote from Walter Lord. So Lord even offered up a personal family story to prove this point. Lord's mother, in her youth, had been torn by affairs of the heart, which is a very nice way, I'm sure, of saying maybe
Affairs of the
heart. Maybe she was crushing on someone she shouldn't have. I don't know.
Okay.
Affairs of the heart.
That's a better way to say it.
Right?
Yeah.
So I can neither confirm nor deny. I don't know. I'm going to leave that at that. But so her father, in this situation, encouraged her to travel abroad to sort things out. Lord said that his future grandfather, quote, "did not care where she went, how long she stayed, or what ship she took, so long as she sailed with Captain Smith. On occasional business trips, he himself had sailed with Smith and swore by the man."
Wow, so she has a problem with affairs of the heart. He's going to send her traipsing around the world on luxury liners. My goodness.
But she has to stay with Captain Smith.
Well, okay.
That's your one thing.
That doesn't sound all that bad.
I mean, I would have taken that deal.
Oh, heck yeah.
I will dump that guy for that deal. So to me, not only is there a relationship between Captain Smith and the first-class passengers, there's a level of affection and loyalty. They liked him. They trusted him. He ensured that they were treated well. It's a reciprocal relationship that benefited both sides.
And I can see that. I mean, he was very good at what he did, and he was very knowledgeable, and he took good care of them. And I can see where you would have a relationship where you get to really trust, and you want to be with that person in control.
And if you're going back and forth across the Atlantic, so that's a week at a time, and you're doing it many, many, many times per season, because we're not talking seasons like spring, winter, fall, summer. We're talking seasons as in social seasons. So it's going to be whenever the next big party is, whether that's in America or in England, or I would assume in France or wherever else.
Okay.
So they knew each other.
Oh, that is interesting. I knew of the social season. I did not know that aspect in relation to the Titanic and Captain Smith. So
I thought it was fascinating.
Very interesting. So returning to our discussion on the different ways in which the passengers were alerted to the lifebelt order, first-class passenger Jack Thayer and his father were among the few personally warned by Thomas Andrews. Jack wrote in his memoirs, quote, "It was now shortly after midnight. My father and I came in from the cold deck to the hallway or lounge. There were quite a few people standing around questioning each other in a dazed kind of way. No one seemed to know what next to do. We saw as they passed Mr. Ismay, Mr. Andrews, and some of the ship's officers. Mr. Andrews told us he did not give the ship much over an hour to live. We could hardly believe it, and yet if he said so, it must be true. No one was better qualified to know." I mean, my goodness, the person is the builder of the ship, the person who's intimately involved with every aspect, tells you there's not much. There's a little over an hour to live.
And not only the builder, the designer. He is the brains behind Titanic. And apparently, and we'll get into this in the crew episode, Thomas Andrews was a very hands-on man
Mm-hmm.
with, with all the ships that he built, but he was, particularly proud, obviously, of the Olympic class, which included Titanic. So, and then going back to our methodology episode, this is an example of Jack Thayer having access to privileged information. I have not countered another passenger quote wherein Thomas Andrews so openly discusses the inevitable fate of Titanic with a passenger.
Well, it was that relationship that he had. He spent time with the captain. He spent time with these men and with his father's parents and these men as well. So he had that connection. So, however, Jack Thayer goes on to say, at about 12:15 a.m., the stewards passed the word around for everyone to get fully clothed and put on life preservers, which were in each stateroom. We went below right away and found my mother and her maid fully dressed. I hurried into my clothes. We all tied on life preservers, which were really large, thick cork vests. On top of these, we put our overcoats. So here it is. So he's told by Mr. Andrews that the ship is going to sink, and then here it's 12:15. So the question is, was this right after Andrews told him that? I would have gone to my room right away.
And so that's what I think is interesting. So if Jack and his dad are told by the ship's designer around midnight, it doesn't mean straight up 12, who knows. So 12:05, 12:07, that Titanic is doomed. And yet they wait until the stewards to give the order for lifebelts at 12:15 to act on that information? Or could it mean that Jack Sr. and Jr. went below, quote, right away after speaking to Andrews, and the stewards came by their stateroom at 12:15 with the formal order to don lifebelts?
That makes more sense to me. I mean, if I'm on a boat and they tell me it's not going to make it, I'm heading as fast as I can to
Agreed.
lifebelts and
again, because
lifeboats.
Nobody knows. We can't prove it, but there's at least a couple different ways to think about it and break down that information. So in some of the passengers' testimony, their bedroom stewards alerted them promptly, rendered assistance, and directed them to the boat deck. First-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie had gone back to his stateroom to get a heavier coat before meeting up again with James Clinch Smith. Gracie remembered, quote, "As I passed from the corridor into the companionway, my worst fears were confirmed. Men and women were slipping on life preservers, the stewards assisting in adjusting them. Steward Cullen insisted upon my returning to my stateroom for mine. I did so, and he fastened one on me, while I brought out the other for use by somebody else." Before the bedroom stewards could even make it to their stateroom, first-class passengers Cosmo and Lucy Duff Gordon had already been alerted to the order for lifebelts. At Lucy's request, Cosmo had unwillingly left his bed to investigate. However, he returned just 10 minutes later after encountering Colonel J.J. Astor. Lucy wrote, quote, this is about her husband, Cosmo. "He was back looking rather grave. I have just been up to the bridge and seen Colonel Astor," he said. "He told me he was going to ask his wife to dress, and I think you'd better do the same." I hurriedly put on the warmest clothes I could find, covering them with a thick coat. As I was dressing, Miss Francatelli came into the room very agitated. Miss Francatelli is her secretary, by the way. Miss Francatelli said, "There is water down in my cabin, and they are taking the covers off the lifeboats on deck." Just as she finished speaking, a steward knocked at our door. "Sorry to alarm you, madam, but the captain's orders are that all passengers are to put on lifebelts." He laughed and joked as he helped us don them. "Wrap up warmly, for you may have a little trip for an hour or so in one of the lifeboats," he said.
Wow.
Cosmo was so brave to try and keep us in good spirits, making rather a bad jest as to how unappetizing we both looked in those sickly white life preservers which two stewards were hooking around us.
So there's water in the cabin, and the lifeboats are being uncovered. Yeah, I start thinking something's not right here.
It's time to move.
It's time to move. So, while some passengers were given the order for lifebelts relatively quickly, others later reported receiving the order almost an hour after the collision, which would have been anywhere from 25 to 40 minutes after the captain had ordered that the passengers be mustered. For instance, first-class passenger Helen Otsby recounted, quote, "It was a good part of an hour before the stewards came and told us to put our life jackets on and go up on the boat deck. They were very awkward to get on, since there had been no boat drill and nobody even thought of trying on the life jackets. The order to put on the life jackets was the first inkling we had that something was seriously wrong. Many people thought we would just be going off in the lifeboats for a short time as a precaution, then we would probably come back to the ship. The idea had been talked up so long ahead of time that the Titanic was unsinkable, it was hard to get it out of people's minds. So I can see that. Here, there, water's on the bridge, water's in the ship. Got my life belt on, getting in a lifeboat, but I'm only gonna be gone for a little while because the ship can't sink. I mean, my goodness, all the facts, all the objective evidence they're seeing, but yet that
That
the
confirmation bias.
Thank you. That they're
or anchoring bias, either way.
that they're hanging on to. So, but then again, it was cold. So I mean, it's hard to say. There's a lot of factors here.
It
There's
is
a lot of factors. So, second-class passenger Marie Girouin wrote to her sister in France, quote, "It was only an hour after the collision that the order was given, everyone on the deck with life jackets. It was for that reason that so many women and children did not have the time to get dressed, most of them having gone back to sleep." So,
this is such a good point.
yes.
An hour, or it's hour after collision. It's 25 to 40 minutes after Captain Smith ordered for them to be mustered in the first place. I mean, I'll tell you right now, if I had barely woken up because I was barely stirred and I just rolled back over within an hour, I would absolutely be asleep again.
So how many people did not receive the order?
That's
how
a
many
great
people
question.
never knew until water was coming in their cabins?
It's a very good question.
Many passengers remembered finding out about the order for lifebelts because of their fellow passengers, not from the officers or stewards. First-class passenger Isaac Fronthal went below decks immediately to tell his brother Harry Fronthal the conversation he had overheard between Colonel Astor and Captain Smith. Henry wrote in his account, quote, "I was awakened by my brother pounding on my cabin door and insisting upon my getting up. Thinking that I had overslept and was late, I asked what was the matter, and he said that something had happened to the boat. He informed me that he had overheard the captain informing Colonel Astor that something serious had occurred on the boat and advised that everyone put on life preservers. They were lowering the lifeboats."
And remember before where I said, neither Colonel Astor nor Captain Smith survived. And so they can neither confirm nor deny that that conversation took place. But if Isaac repeated that conversation to his brother and his brother is able to recount it and it lines up pretty well, then I'm rather inclined to agree that this probably did happen.
Yes, that is a good primary source for that information. After witnessing the flooding mailroom, first-class passenger Norman Chambers had gone back to the stateroom he shared with his wife Bertha. He remembered, quote, "My wife, having gone out into the passage to note any later developments, came rushing back to me saying that she had seen another passenger who informed her that the call had been given out for lifebelts and to go to the boat deck. I went out myself and found my room steward passing down the alleyway and had the order verified. We then proceeded immediately upward, my wife being rather alarmed, as she had also been at the time of the collision. But for her, I should have remained in bed reading." So here,
she is never going to let him live that down.
Yeah,
ever.
So here she is. She's anxious from the time of the collision. He's saying, "I want to go back to bed." So
well, Norman Chambers is the guy who saw the water in the mailroom and all the letters floating on the top, and he said that but the officer said, she's not taking on any more water. There's nothing to worry about. Go back to bed. And he's the one that had said, in this personally, I agreed with them.
Well, it's a good thing he listened to his wife.
Yes.
Very good.
This is a PSA for everybody.
Yes.
So, Major Arthur Puchin said that he'd been waiting at the base of the grand staircase on Promenade Deck A for about 10 minutes when, quote, "I saw the ladies and gentlemen all coming in off the deck looking very serious. I caught up to Mr. Beatty and said, 'What is the matter?' He said, 'Why, the order is for lifebelts and boats.' I could not believe it at first. It seemed so sudden." First-class passenger Emily Ryerson gave the following deposition to the U.S. Senate inquiry. Quote, "At the time of collision, I was awake and heard the engines stop, but felt no jar. My husband was asleep, so I rang and asked the steward what was the matter. He said, 'There's talk of an iceberg, ma'am, and they've stopped but not run into it.' I told him to keep me informed if there were any orders. About 10 minutes later, I went into the corridor and saw far off people hurrying on deck. A passenger ran by and called out, 'Put on your life belts and come up to the boat deck.' I said, 'Where did you get those orders?' He said, 'From the captain.'"
So this guy says that they did not run into the iceberg.
He flat out told her they did not run into the iceberg.
Wow.
Now, the implication here is that her bedroom steward never came back.
Oh, wow.
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
now maybe he just hadn't made it to them. But I will say that the ratio of stewards to first-class passengers is it's a lot smaller. So it's like I don't want to give a number, but let's pretend it's like 1 to 10. Okay. Whereas the stewards to third class would have been more like 1 to 50.
So they have to go around to each and every cabin and make sure
that's underneath their charge. And so that's why your bedroom steward would be checking in on you. Do you need any assistance? Is there anything you need? Do you have any questions? So they have their own the cabins. Picture like a waiter in a restaurant where he's got his section.
Oh, yeah.
The stewards have their section. But yeah, he definitely didn't come back around to tell her. She had to see it from somebody else.
Interesting. I'm sure there's a lot of that going on. Well, at least, like I said, there are people that never got the order. There's people that probably never even knew that anything was going on.
Oh, just you wait, Henry Higgins. Okay. Just you wait. First-class passenger Michaela Douglas stated in her U.S. Senate inquiry affidavit, quote, "Now people commenced to appear with life preservers, and I heard from someone that the order had been given to put them on. I took 3 from our cabin. Mr. Douglas met me as I was going up to find him and asked, jestingly, what I was doing with those life preservers. He did not think even then that the accident was serious."
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, so it's, so they don't know, they can't find the life preservers. They don't know how to put them on. They need help to put them on. I mean, it definitely would have been, I'm surprised that that was not gone through when people get on the boat. In other words, safety. This is what you do. This is, just in my mind, in my 20th century mind and 21st century mind, I'm thinking safety. What were they thinking back then?
We actually have one of my aunts is on a cruise right now, and she actually posted a picture of like the safety video that was playing in her cabin, and I was very relieved to see it. It was like, oh, thank goodness. Okay, cool. And then you had made the point earlier that so if the other people, so what was it, Gladys Cherry and Cornelia Andrews, they go down, they can't find the lifebelts, but Michaela found the lifebelts.
Ah, good point.
So
good point.
Did her cabin have the notices posted, or did she just travel more often on White Star Line ships?
Oh, it could be. Well, it could be any number of things. It could be that. It could be that possibly the other lady who could not find it was just maybe not as aware and maybe just not, looking around in the right places.
Maybe she's shorter. Because they keep saying that they're up on top of the cabinets.
Oh, well, there you go.
Speaking as a short girl.
There you go.
I'm just saying.
It would be kind of hard to see. So there could be various things that led to that occurring. So that's a good point, though.
And some passengers just so happened to notice that people were walking around with life belts on, such as first-class passenger Mae Futrell, who said, quote, "We looked out of the cabin and saw people putting on life belts. None of them seemed greatly alarmed, but we thought it wise to follow their example."
Yes, I would think so.
And some, it is fair to assume, were not warned at all. As you will see in the following quote, first-class passenger Martha Stone was warned by a fellow passenger, but she left us with a very astute observation regarding those who are not so lucky. Quote, "The blowing of steam went on interminably. It got on my nerves at last, and I resolved to get up and investigate for myself." Because remember, this would have been what we were talking about last time with the deafening noise that would have been heard all throughout the multiple floors, not just up on the boat deck. So she gets up to investigate. And then she says, "The daughter of the woman opposite came flying down the corridor crying, 'Get on your life preservers quickly. They say we must get to the boats.' If I had gone to sleep, I should not be here. Not a single warning was given in the part of the ship in which I was. No one came to tell us. No bell was rung. No horn was sounded. We could have died like rats in a trap for all the warning we received. Now remember, I can only speak of what occurred in my own part of the ship. Whether other passengers were warned, I do not know."
Wow. Oh, my goodness. And that actually, this is coming from the other quotes that we read as well about the delayed responses by some of the crew to the passengers. People not, like I said, one gentleman said he could have gone back to bed. He would have gone back to sleep. So the fact that
if his wife had not gone out in that corridor, would the steward have knocked on their door? We don't know.
Oh, we don't know. Yeah, and that steam is very loud, and it is it kind of it makes you uncomfortable. It kind of disorients you a little bit if you just allow the sound, because it's a very, very loud sound. You have to make sure you protect. You'll lose your hearing.
Oh,
it's that loud. So up on deck, it would have been worse. It would have been better further down that you got away from the steam blowing, because you would have had some protection. But that loud sound with all that's going on, people wearing lifeboats, life belts, water in cabins. I mean, for the people that saw and heard those things, I'd like to think that I would have put my life belt on.
I'm telling you right now, I am this woman. What
Yes.
is that noise? Make it stop. She is me. I am her.
Yeah. So of course, not all the first and second class passenger story fall nicely into one of these categories. For instance, second class passenger Lawrence Beasley had returned to his cabin again after having the conversation about the man who did not want to get out of bed. He then, quote, sat on the sofa and read for some 10 minutes, when I then heard the open door above, the noise of people passing up and down, and a loud shout from above, all passengers on deck with lifebelts on. So here you have the some of the crew told people, other passengers told some people, and here you have Beasley. He's hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
He's just hearing a shout from somewhere. So
yeah, Beasley was neither personally warned by a steward nor advised by a fellow passenger. He just so happened to overhear the order.
Right.
Pure happenstance.
So here you have all these different ways of transmitting this information is happening. There's nothing consistent. So
No, consistency is not the name of the
yeah,
game
there's
here.
all these variables. So that's going to make it, once again, it's going to give people a chance to say, I wonder if this is important or not. It's cold. I'm going to go back to bed. So
But I'm going to tell you right now. So Beasley, once he hears the order, first thing he does is tuck 2 books into his overcoat pockets, and I respect that so much.
Oh, you who love to read, yes.
I do.
And then first-class passenger Edith Rosenbaum had only returned to her stateroom, had only just returned to her stateroom when she found out about the order for lifebelts. It was more than 50 years later that she shared her story in the Ladies' Home Companion. Quote, I started to undress, and I was nearly in bed when a young man I knew came to my door and said, there's a man saying there's an order given out that we are to put on lifebelts. I said, what for? Well, he said, that is the order. I went to my room quickly, slipped on a dress, just seizing anything that came to hand, and put on a long fur coat and rushed out into the lounge. In going to the lounge, I passed the open door of a friend's room who had told me to put on a lifebelt. He said, do you think we should leave the boat? I said, certainly not. And then we went to the lounge on A deck, where I was met by my room steward, Wareham, who was fully dressed in his overcoat and derby hat. He said, well, miss, I'm very glad to see you're up. I replied, Wareham, do you think there's any danger, or is this just English rules? That is, one has to put on lifebelts. He answered, it is a rule of the Board of Trade that in time of danger, lifebelts must be put on by passengers. Now, I do not think this boat can sink. It is an unsinkable boat. But if it does sink, she can certainly hold out about 48 hours. I said, what about all my beautiful dresses, knickknacks, etc.? Do you think they will transfer luggage? He answered me, now, if I were you, I think I'd go back to your room and kiss them goodbye.
Not professional.
No, that's not. I said, in that case, do you think the boat is going to sink? And he answered, no one thinks anything, we hope.
So I'm sorry. I'm just going to make this point real quick. There's a lot to unpack here. But my first thing is, okay, so if her steward is already in the first class lounge on Promenade Deck A, and he's already fully dressed with his hat on, that means he's not in his working uniform anymore. And he's not in her corridor waking her up.
Right.
So I'm just saying.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a very good point.
So, I mean, this means, or it infers anyway, that he was not going around to the staterooms to wake up those in his care.
Well, the fact that he says it's unsinkable, and even if she does sink, that she can hold out for 48 hours. So there's all these variables of the unsinkable ship.
Well, and remember, we talked about she can't sink, or she'll only sink so far and then she'll stay. And that seems to be, people don't mean that she can't have a hole punctured in her. You know, they don't mean that. They know she can be damaged.
Right.
They think that she will not completely and utterly disappear below the water.
Okay.
Seems to be
Yeah,
what they mean.
yes, because there's so many other variables. They talked about it breaking in pieces, staying afloat. If it had a leak, it would stay afloat. The watertight compartments, it would stay afloat. So you're right. There's
Asteroid from space, it'll stay afloat.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, so those that heeded the order for lifebelts started making their way up to the upper decks as instructed, some with better attitudes than others. First-class passenger Lucy Duff Gordon gave a very colorful account of her trek on the boat deck. Quote, we went quickly out into the main passage and found at the end, gathered about the stairs, a great and noisy throng of people. Everybody at ease as ourselves.
That's a weird statement. Everybody as ill at
ease as ourselves, but putting brave faces on and doing a lot of silly chatting and laughing. We went past them and climbed the steps to the boat deck. While there was such a crowd at the top, we were obliged to wait some minutes while the queue filtered through. This was most aggravating, and I was very near losing my temper at all the ribald fellows grouped around us. All American youths, of course, with their filthy humor.
Sorry. All I could picture is her like shaking her little fist going, youths!
I just don't think I've ever heard the ribald before.
It's ribald.
Oh, ribald. That ribald.
Still, yeah.
is
Basically, she's getting mad at the young men.
Oh, okay. I just said I've not used that in a sentence, but I'll try to use that in a sentence this week.
I dare you to incorporate that into a sentence in real life.
Others, like first-class passenger William Sloper, remembered this time with apprehension rather than annoyance. Almost immediately after he and Dorothy Gibson saw Thomas Andrews rushing up the first-class companionway, Sloper recalled, quote, "Someone else appeared at this moment and said that the water was rushing in through the squash court wall and that she was filling rapidly. We are now ordered by the stewards to put on life preservers in case anything should happen that should make it necessary for us to leave the ship. We returned to our staterooms for our life preservers and assembled on the upper stairway leading out to the top deck. The feeling which came over me as I stood in the companionway with these people while we tied on our life preservers cannot be put down adequately on paper. As long as I live, I shall never forget that feeling. I could only think that I must be asleep and in an awful dream. As a man, I was bound to cheer up the ladies and act as calm as I could, but to stay that I felt that way underneath would be untrue. All this time, there was no sign of panic or distress among passengers or crew. Everyone behaved wonderfully calm and cheerful. All the people who were there in this companionway at this time passed quietly onto the deck where the lifeboats were. I remember distinctly there was no crowding through the doorway. Everyone was over polite." Those words just really strike me that he's standing there, those people putting on lifebelts, the ship is sinking. Yeah, I mean, it's like when you have a bad dream and you say, okay, wake up. Okay, wake up now.
Or you think that you are awake.
Right.
And then you really wake up.
And so the fact that he wasn't asleep and this was real and really happening to him at that moment in time. Yeah. That really struck me, that quote.
Sloper's account is very, very good. Mm-hmm. It's worth the read for sure.
Yes.
So, as the passengers are making their way up to the upper deck, let's take a moment and zoom out on the overall scene. Captain Smith gave the order to muster the passengers sometime between midnight and 12:15 a.m., an order which the passengers heard in a variety of ways, from the captain's own mouth, from the bedroom stewards, from fellow passengers, or not at all. If you recall from our Titanic episode number 2, the passenger accommodations were spread out from Promenade Deck A all the way down to Lower Deck G. That's 7 stories. First class accommodations were located amidships, second class was located aft of amidships, so closer to the stern, and third class was located forward of amidships, so closer to the bow. In order for the passengers to report to the upper decks as instructed, they traveled via their designated companionways. The first class had 2 main companionways. The primary first-class companionway, known forever as the Grand Staircase, reached all the way to the boat deck, but the secondary first-class companionway only reached to Promenade Deck A. This means that the companionway a first-class passenger chose to ascend determined whether they exited onto the boat deck or the promenade deck. Fortunately for first-class passengers, even if they initially ascended the secondary companionway, all they had to do was walk along Deck A to the forward companionway and climb the rest of the way up to the boat deck. However, the issue of companionways became a much larger problem for the second and third class passengers.
Interesting.
The second class also had 2 main companionways. The primary companionway went up to the boat deck, but the secondary companionway only went so far as bridge deck B. So boat, promenade A, bridge B. So that's the third deck down total. Mm-hmm. The third class only had 1 companionway, which was located near the stern and only reached as high as shelter deck C. Why does this matter?
I was going to say, that's as high as they could get with shelter deck C?
Yes.
And where were all the lifeboats? Were they?
You're getting ahead of me.
Sorry.
Getting ahead of me. Why does this matter? Why does this matter? We discussed in the second Titanic episode that the Titanic was designed in such a way that the companionways deliberately led persons of a particular class to the accommodations and amenities intended for them. It also prevented the three classes from accessing anything outside their designated areas, which made freely traveling between decks impossible. During the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912, Titanic's passengers were following the flow of the ship's design, which directed them to their designated areas as they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Only some of these designated areas contained lifeboats, and only certain classes of passengers had access to them.
That just doesn't make sense.
Remember how we said in an earlier episode that the flow of Titanic's companionways would later come back and haunt the designers? Here we are.
Yes, I understand. That just, I mean, the fact that you have 2,200 plus souls on board, and you're directing some people to no lifeboats while you're directing the smaller percentage to more lifeboats, it just doesn't make sense.
So as the first-class passengers exited their companionways, they made an arbitrary decision to turn left or right, to go either to port or starboard of the ship. Little did they know that this seemingly insignificant decision had profound consequences. For this chapter of the Titanic story, it's absolutely crucial to note that the loading and launching of lifeboats on the starboard versus port sides of the ship were executed in completely different ways. There were even discrepancies between how the rules applied to lifeboats on the same side of the ship.
So between say different sides of the ship is different, between different lifeboats is different.
Between different lifeboats on the same side of the ship is different.
My goodness.
It really comes down to there's no policy. It's not that there was too many policies. There was not enough policies. So the information and instructions that the first and second class passengers were given was dependent upon which side of the ship they found themselves at a particular moment in time. This would ultimately affect who survived and who did not.
Oh my goodness. So you're saying no policies, no procedures, just basically chaos.
It's happenstance.
Happenstance. Okay, maybe not chaos, but just the fact that...
But really break down that sentence in your mind. The information and instructions that the first and second class passengers were given was dependent upon which side of the ship they found themselves at a particular moment in time.
Okay.
So it doesn't even mean one side versus the other. It means what part of our stages of sinking are we in?
Oh, gotcha. So it varied in time, even in the same side or the same location.
Yes.
Interesting. So the first class passengers drifted between the boat deck and promenade deck A, crisscrossing between the port and starboard sides and forming into smaller groups as they traded information and passed the time. First class passenger Henry Harper described it like this, quote, "Funny thing to remember how they scattered here and there, 2 or 3 crossing over from one group to another, and 2 or 3 going from that group to still another. They all seemed curious, but not a bit anxious." So the layout of Titanic lent itself to the passengers forming into smaller groups. The very center of the boat deck was comprised of buildings that housed the navigating bridge, officers' quarters, gymnasium, first-class entrance, etc. These buildings were encircled by a walkable deck space with the lifeboats being stored on the outer edge along the deck railing. This layout prevented those standing on the starboard side of the boat to see what was happening on the port side and vice versa. So their view was blocked.
So we were actually, when we were working on this episode, we were sitting out on Daddy's front porch, and it's like a very long deck, and we were discussing that, it's like one of those narrower decks that it's probably like maybe 5 or 6 feet wide, but it was probably 35 to 40 feet long.
Yep.
And when one of the quotes that we will read, that's probably about the amount of space that they were being able to see at any one juncture because of all of the buildings in the way.
So they had the obstructions. They had obstruction from side to side. So also there was a significant amount of deck space between the forward and aft set of lifeboats. In A Night to Remember, Walter Lord gives a great description of how the lifeboats were organized. Quote, "On the boat deck, men began to clear the 16 wooden lifeboats. There were 8 on each side, a cluster of 4 near the bow, and an open space of 190 feet, and then another 4 toward the stern. As the night wore on, passengers tended to congregate around the lifeboats. meaning that the number of passengers on each side of the ship were further broken down into smaller groups. So
190 feet between the lifeboat, and we're talking on the same side. So let's talk
side,
starboard, because I'm holding up my right hand right now because I can't help but talk with my hands. So starboard side,
right.
You've got there's 16 boats total. That means 16 of the wooden lifeboats. Okay, we'll start there because there's the emergency boats, but we won't get there yet. So there's 16 divided by 2, that's 8 and 8. So that means you've got a cluster of 4 near the forward starboard side and a cluster of 4 near the aft starboard side. The space in between the very back forward starboard lifeboat and the very forward aft starboard lifeboat is almost 200 feet away from each other.
That is correct.
And you would have had all those people.
All those people. That's a lot of distance to cover when you got 200 people that are milling around. So, so second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley, as always, cuts to the heart of the issue. Quote, "The reader must remember that the ship was 1/6 of a mile long, with passengers on 3 decks open to the sea and port and starboard sides to each deck. He will then get some idea of the difficulty presented to the officers of keeping control for such a large area, and the impossibility of anyone knowing what was happening except in his own immediate vicinity." That is so true. I mean, you're only going to really know what's happening right around you. You're not going to know what's happening 300 feet or 200 to 300 feet ahead of you or behind you in whatever case.
I love Beasley. He has such a wonderfully analytical mind.
Yeah, I really his information has been very, very good. This point is further illustrated by the following quote by first-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge. Quote, "We were in semi-darkness on the boat deck, and owing to the immense length and breadth of the vessel and the fact that between the port and starboard side of the boat deck there were officers' cabins, a gymnasium, etc., it would have been impossible, even in the daylight, to have obtained a view of but a limited portion of this boat deck. We only knew what was going on within a radius of possibly 40 feet. So that's it. I mean,
that's where that porch example is perfect.
Yes. Yeah, that's the amount of distance that they could actually see. Beyond that, there was just no way they knew what was going on, if they should go there, how it was being taken care of or managed, how the boats were being loaded.
It could be even worse on the other side. So what if you go to the other side and it's worse, and then you lose out your opportunity here?
Right. Oh yeah, that would have been, at that point in time, you don't know. I mean, if you're not being directed, you're told to get a life belt, and it's on. You're told to go to the deck, you're there, and they're uncovering lifeboats. What then?
What? No. Well, yeah. So another really important fact about this is that the passengers would have felt very cut off from anyone not within their immediate radius. Being visually cut off from the rest of the ship led many passengers to testify that they were in one of the last lifeboats to leave Titanic, because from their perspective, they were. And then I made the note about your deck. So there's a lot of people that they're in the second or third lifeboat to leave the boat total, and they say, I was the last lifeboat to leave Titanic.
And how would they know any different?
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't, because they couldn't see.
So as we're zoomed out and taking a look at the overall scene between the mustering of the passengers and the loading of the lifeboats, I'd like to share a quote from second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley's memoirs, because I just can't help myself. It is lengthy, but it helps set the stage for Titanic's final hours. Please note what you're about to hear is not an argument from a historian or an opinion from me. It's an honest-to-goodness statement of fact from someone whose feet were literally on Titanic's decks during the early morning hours of April 15th, 1912. Quote, "Now, before we consider any further the events that followed, it is important to keep in thought the amount of information at the passengers' disposal. Men and women act according to judgment based on knowledge of the conditions around them, and the best way to understand some apparently inconceivable things that happened is for anyone to imagine himself or herself standing on deck that night. It seems a mystery to some people that women refused to leave the ship, that some persons retired to their cabins, and so on, but it is a matter of judgment after all. So that if the reader will come and stand with the crowd on deck, he must first rid himself entirely of the knowledge that Titanic has sunk, an important necessity, for he cannot see conditions as they existed there through the mental haze arising from knowledge of the greatest maritime tragedy the world has known. He must get rid of any foreknowledge of disaster to appreciate why people acted as they did. Secondly, He had better get rid of any picture in thought painted either by his own imagination or by some artist, whether pictorial or verbal, quote, from information supplied. Some are most inaccurate, and where they err on the highly dramatic side. They need not have done so. The whole conditions were dramatic enough in all their bare simplicity, without the addition of any high coloring. Having made these mental erasures, he will find himself as one of the crowd faced with the following conditions: a perfectly still atmosphere, a brilliantly beautiful starlit night, but no moon, a ship that had come quietly to rest without any indication of disaster, no iceberg visible, no hole in the ship's side through which water was pouring in, nothing broken or out of place, no sound of alarm, no panic, no movement of anyone except at a walking pace, the absence of any knowledge of the nature of the accident, of the extent of damage, of the danger of the ship sinking in a few hours, of the number of boats, rafts, and other life-saving appliances available, their capacity, what other ships were near or coming to help. In fact, almost complete absence of any positive knowledge on any point.
Wow.
End quote.
That is amazing. And he's absolutely right. We looking at this, we know what happened. We know all the facts of the matter, or at least we know a lot of the facts of the matter.
And some things just get filled in by your imagination.
Yes.
Or frankly, by the movie.
So, but standing there that night, not knowing what we know, and the things you and I have talked about, it's hard to say what I would have thought or felt or done, because it's really the variables were so real to those people in that moment. What they experienced was real to them.
Well, and if we're talking
and they
about
processed it.
What do you see with your lion eyes? It's right here. Nothing. They see nothing.
They see nothing. And why would you? If up to that point in time there had not, I'm not going to say there had been no maritime disasters. But
there had been some.
There had been some, but I mean, this brand new maiden voyage, brand new ship, unsinkable,
technological marvel.
Yes, hype, and
they don't see anything wrong.
And they're not seeing anything happening. So it just led some people to act the way that take the actions that they did.
Exactly.
So and it's, like I said, it's hard to say what I would have done that night if I had been back in 1912 and living in their shoes. So.
So while Beasley's account focuses on erasing preconceived notions, first-class passenger Colonel Archibald Gracie's accounts adds in details to help set the scene. Quote, out on deck A, so this is promenade deck A, port side, towards the stern, many men and women had already collected. I sought and found the unprotected ladies to whom I had proffered my services during the voyage when they boarded the ship at Southampton. How little did I know of the responsibility I took upon myself for their safety. Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, Colonel and Mrs. Astor, and others well known to me were among those congregated on the port side of Deck A, including, besides Clinch Smith, two of our coterie of after-dinner companions, Hugh Woolner and H. Bjornstrom Stephenson. It was now that the band began to play and continued while the boats were being lowered. We considered this a wise provision tending to allay excitement. I did not recognize any of the tunes, but I know they were cheerful and were not hymns.
Oh, my goodness. So,
because people argue about the music that was played. I'm just going to say it.
There were some quotes we had earlier, I think it was last episode, where they said they did not hear music. So I wonder.
Oh, no, it's this one.
Oh, is this one?
You're remembering us reading through this.
Okay. So we named this part of the episode Hurry Up and Wait, because that is essentially the only information that the passengers were given. After being hurried to the upper decks for their lifebelts, the first and second class passengers were then left completely on their own. No instructions. Nothing to do besides watch the crew as they prepared the lifeboats. It's important to note that at this point in the night, most of the passengers saw the prepping of the lifeboats as a precautionary measure. There was no indication yet that the boats would ever leave the ship. The lack of information was frustrating for many. For first-class passenger Henry Harper made some particularly scathing comments about Titanic's crew. Quote, perhaps a quarter of an hour later, word was passed that we'd better put on life preservers. Some people put on the lifebelts and others laughed at them. Then came a long wait. I was surprised that there was no officer in sight to direct people where to go or to warn them or reassure them. We were left to ourselves. It was rather like a stupid picnic where you don't know anybody and wonder how soon you'll get away from such a boresome place. I couldn't help wondering what had become of all the fine sea discipline I had heard and read about so much. I said to myself, these steamship men are hotel keepers rather than sailor men. They hit an iceberg, and then tell their guests they'd better go back to bed. I was pretty sore by that time, and I think anyone would be who knows anything about seafaring.
Now remember, Henry Harper is the gentleman who had already survived a shipwreck.
Oh, the shipwreck? He's the shipwreck.
This is that guy, the one who's also suffering from tonsillitis, the one that had to basically crawl his way up from his stateroom to the boat deck. So he's having a bad night.
So he has some experience with seafaring crews.
He does. Oh, and he rips them one later on.
So second-class passenger Lawrence Beasley had this to say about the long wait. Quote, "The roar and hiss of escaping steam from the boilers made conversation difficult and no doubt increased the apprehension of some people merely because of the volume of noise. I heard very little conversation of any kind among the passengers. It was not the slightest exaggeration to say that no sign of alarm were exhibited by anyone. There was no indication of panic or hysteria, no cries of fear, and no running to and fro to discover what was the matter. While we had been summoned up on deck with lifebelts and what was to be done with us, now we were there, the crowd of men and women stood quietly on the deck or paced slowly up and down, waiting for orders from the officers." So, during the long wait, there were two prevalent topics of conversation: the various ships allegedly rushing to Titanic's side to transfer everyone off, and a mysterious white light off the ship's port bow. So, while waiting on the port side, first-class passenger Emily Ryerson recalled, quote, "My chief thought and that of everyone else was, I know not to make a fuss and to do as we are told. My husband joked with some of the women he knew, and I heard him say, 'Don't you hear the band playing?' I begged him to let me stay with him, and he said, 'You must obey orders. You must go when your turn comes. I'll stay with John Thayer. We will be all right. You take a boat going to New York.' This referred to the belief that there was a circle of ships around waiting. The Olympic, the Baltic were some of the names I heard. So here they are thinking that there's ships out there that are coming to their rescue.
And they've got names.
So that had to have been something that had to have been passed around, information from someone, crew or passengers.
We're going to get into the crew episode, but there were quite a few of these ships that the Marconi wireless operators were in communication with. That is true.
Okay, very good. First-class passenger Dr. Washington Dodge observed, "Many expressed their determination to take their chances with the steamer rather than embark in the lifeboats. This unusual circumstance may be accounted for by the fact that the officers had insisted that under the worst conditions possible, the Titanic would not sink in less than 8 or 10 hours, and that a number of steamers had been communicated with by wireless and would be standing by to offer relief within an hour or two." So yeah, stay on the great big terra firma boat or get off in a little dinghy in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in 26-degree weather or
and you're being
water.
lowered 80 feet from the boat deck.
Well, I can certainly see where that could have been a factor.
And lowering, we'll get into it later. I feel like that's the theme for this episode. We'll get into it later. But lowering of lifeboats was very hazardous. It was not an easy task.
Okay. Let's continue with first-class passenger Cornelia Andrews, who later wrote, quote, "The discipline was good, probably because none of us appreciated the danger. They told us the Olympic would pick us up in 2 hours and that the ship would stand for hours without sinking." And then first-class passenger Archibald Gracie remembered feeling hopeful at this point in the night, quote, "Our hopes were buoyed with the information imparted through the ship's officers. There had been an interchange of wireless messages with passing ships, one of which was certainly coming to our rescue. To reassure the ladies of whom I had assumed special charge, I showed them a bright white light of what I took to be a ship about 5 miles off, and which I felt sure was coming to our rescue." So here we have crews they're saying that the crew told them about the
officers.
ships. Oh, officers. So yeah, that's so this white light. What they thought would be the Californian? Is that what?
The white light to which Gracie is referring is commonly believed to be the Californian, but I feel like I got to have my button for the theme. We'll get into that later.
Okay.
It's almost like that. What is that Staples button? The easy button?
The easy button. Yeah,
We'll
just
get into
kind
that
of
later.
Gotcha. And then we're going to continue with first-class passenger Jack Thayer, who recorded in his memoirs, quote, "While I did not see the masthead lights of the SS Californian, many claim they did see them. My mother watched them for some time while on the port side, waiting to get into a lifeboat, and Second Officer Lightoller told me he positively saw them." So, I mean, here you got people saying we're seeing the lights.
It is one of the things that when I started off with the U.S. inquiry I constantly was noticing and circling this mystery light. It is shocking how many times the mystery light comes up throughout the inquiry. So there was certainly something out there, but it takes until the investigation of the Senate inquiry to get down to the bottom of it, because spoiler alert, that boat does not come and it does not transfer passengers off. So if a boat really was that close, why didn't it help?
Why didn't they take action?
Exactly.
So.
And that's what has to be investigated pretty thoroughly.
Yes.
So while some of the passengers were watching for approaching ships, others were socializing and joking around. First-class passenger Vera Dick told the Washington Post, quote, "One of the most interesting sidelights on the whole tragedy is the way some of the women in evening dress faced the tragedy. It was evident that they did not appreciate the danger. One man handed a lifesaver to a woman with the remark, 'We're wearing these this season. They are most becoming.' One woman had a fox terrier in her arms, and the man told her to try a lifesaver on the dog. 'Everyone is wearing them now,' he laughed. It was evident that many people thought that there was too much agitation, and that for a boat of that kind to sink was positive or absolutely impossible. The captain had ordered the band to play and to play continuously so that the women would not feel they were in danger. They kept on playing jolly, happy tunes." First-class passenger Caroline Bonnell was only too happy to be up on deck. She'd been hoping the entire trip to see an iceberg, but was advised it was probably too late in the season. As she waited on Promenade Deck A with her cousin, aunt, and uncle, she observed, quote, "Crowds of people were standing about, no one seemed excited, everyone was talking, and it seemed the general idea that we would soon be ordered back to bed. Just then an officer came up to us and explained we should go up to the next deck, the boat deck. By that time, nearly everyone was up. There was no confusion here, even yet, although we noticed that the boat was beginning to list towards the starboard." So this last quote showcases the first indication that something is about to happen after the long wait, and it is not sending the passengers back to bed.
Wow.
But that will have to wait until next episode.
So that will wait until next episode. And the other things we talked about will wait till the other, because I know you've done a lot of research
trust
on
me.
all of this.
All of this,
but
all in good time.
But you bring up good when you go through this. You make me. I have these questions. That just makes me wonder. So
well, and much as I would love to answer them right now, but I'm very carefully crafting how this information is being laid out so that it's not just a what is that phrase, like a fire hydrant. I'm trying not to fire hydrant all over y'all.
No.
Because it would just be just too jumbled. And so anyway, I'm trying to be very careful with how this information is given. That way we can just kind of build on these building blocks, because the whole point is the understanding. I want to get into the minds and the feelings and the psychology and the real life variables and factors that these people faced, not just a story or a narrative.
Right. And they had quite a few from distance, not being able to see, not know things that were happening in different parts of the boat that they had no idea, had no way of knowing if I go to port, should I go to starboard, should I go aft, should I go forward. There was so many people that never received the orders at all.
And it's also, there's the personal relationships. So notice that Archibald Gracie, he said that Stuart Cullen basically ordered him like a child, go back to your stateroom and get your life belt, And then you've got, oh heavens, how embarrassing, I can't remember her name, Edith Rosenbaum, where her steward is chilling up in the lounge with his bowler hat on, being like, "Oh, gee, I'm so glad you're awake." So they still had those kind of networks of people that it was either working for you or you were kind of on your own.
Well, I appreciate the way that you had this research you've done and the way that you've structured it to allow us to understand from their own words what they experienced, and that some of the confusion and the variables that were in that confusion.
Yes.
Because these are things I've never heard in a Titanic movie or a Titanic, like the show you and I watched, whatever that was.
The Discovery Channel.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'm not going to say, talk about it later. Real quick, the Discovery Channel documentary, there's parts of it that are really fantastic. They kind of get into the forensics, and they've got it, it's obviously kind of bigger budget. It's got one of the actors out of the Titanic movie in it who's narrating, and so they put the ship up there, and they kind of show you how the water goes from here to here to here, and you can kind of see the forensics of the ship sinking. That is amazing. They do quote from sources, but I'm telling you right now, some of the stuff they put in there is not accurate. And it's well known. So this isn't just me being like, no, it's not accurate. It is well known within the Titanic community that that is a very problematic documentary.
Oh, okay.
So it's one of those, watch it, but do not have that be your only source of information. Do
Right.
read the other. Oh my gosh, there's so many books, so many articles, there's so many people passionate about this topic who have spent years of their lives, if not decades, devoted to finding out the truth.
Well, that's why all I know of Titanic is the documentary or the movie. I did not know anything. This information that we're sharing with you, our listeners, and that you're sharing with me, Courtney, I never knew. And so it's been a real learning experience. So I really appreciate that, because it really was a real life experience that these people went through, and to hear their stories helps me to understand better what did happen. And not, maybe not mechanically or physically, but emotionally and mentally with the people that were on board.
Yes.
So I appreciate that.
It takes it out of just the sensationalism and kind of the sexiness of the story into like these poor. And wait till you get to the crew, because I really resonate with the crew. I did a lot with serving in customer service and catering and all these different things. So I feel if I was on Titanic, I probably would have been working as like a stewardess. So I just cannot wait to get into that part of the story.
Okay.
So our plan. So wrapping up, we have reached. We're going to start loading the lifeboats next time. When we meet again, we will start the loading and the launching of the lifeboats. And then after that point, we will talk about the third class passengers, because we haven't gotten to talk to them yet. That whole episode is going to be structured differently because their stories are structured differently. So to do them justice, we're going to highlight them in such a way so that you guys get to know them a little bit better. So that's going to be the plan for the next couple of episodes.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. All right. So with that, we will sign off, and you go first.
It's like, I'm Courtney.
I'm Brian.
And this is The Primary Nerd.